I remember when we published it in 2002, and I remember the couple of years with Kenneth, sort of preparing it for publication, and I kind of found it quite a forbidding text actually, and a lot there, and yet over the last few days, while I've been researching this talk, I just come across the most amazing parallels with my own work, including one that I came across, say a couple of days ago, that I was in the vernacular gobsmacked, because it was quite so striking, and what it really means is I'm going to sit down and just dive into this talk, this book over the next few years. Anyway, I mean, I've got you to thank really, because without this Watkins talk, I very possibly wouldn't have discovered that about it. Take a bow. So, as I said, we published the first edition of The Ninth Arch in 2002. As Carl said, it is actually the ninth and final book, in the Typhonian Trilogies, and as such, it's actually the peak, if you like. If you can look, you can, if you wish, consider the previous 8 and everything that Kenneth wrote and studied from before then, from when he first got seriously interested in the occult in 1939. Kenneth is in a way chucking in everything, including the kitchen sink, and it's an absolutely fascinating work. Anyway, as I say, we published in 2002, and we had a launch at the Plough in Museum Street on the last Saturday before Christmas, and it was very good because we could mix it with festivities, so we had mince pies and mulled wine and things like this. We published a second edition in 2016, and like all of the Starfire second editions, we were able to sort of put in colour plates, rephotograph plates, add new plates, etc. And it's actually, the Ninth Arch has actually got my favourite. It's my favourite plate section actually of all the trilogy volumes. It's wonderful stuff. So how did this book come about? Well, in 1980, Muller published Outside the Circles of Time, and it was in fact the last book of Kenneth Grant's that they published. I personally think that they'd always found Kenneth, they never really had that level of experience to sort of properly do Kenneth's work justice. Having said that, I mean, some of their volumes are really good, like Aleister Crowley and the Hidden God is in this lovely large format with really generous margins, very good quality paper, and it's very good. But I think with Circles, I think they couldn't really be bothered that much, and it shows in the production of Circles. You buy the first edition of Circles, and it's got yellowing, crumbling paper. My copy, a couple of years after I bought it, in 1980, every time I opened it, the binding would crack. It was astonishingly bad, really. Anyway, Kenneth's next book was Outside the Circles, Hecate's Fountain, and he offered it to Muller, but they weren't interested. So he eventually, Weiser in the United States were going to publish it. But then a certain corporation in the United States, whose name escapes me, forced Weiser to renege on the contract, and so Kenneth just basically didn't have a publisher for several years. But he carried on writing, and he planned out planning out that final trilogy. He hadn't really planned things out like that before, like say the first 3 books. You know, that was going to be it, and then he sort of decided to write more. So he sat down and he actually planned out the final trilogy. It was to include the 2 transmitted texts from New Isis Lodge, for instance. It was to have an exposition of the Mauve Zone, sandwiched between. And he'd never done that level of planning before, so it was really, really good for somebody that didn't actually have a publisher and didn't really have a prospect of a publisher at that time. So there's this really interesting portion in Hecate's Fountain. And he mentions the Book of the Spider in there, and he says, in 1955, the 11-pointed star of Set beyond Yuggoth, the star known as New Isis, began transmitting the vibrations that were received by New Isis Lodge at that time. These transmissions lasted 7 years, and the results are embodied in my trilogies and in a certain secret grimoire known as the Book of the Spider, which will remain unpublished until a predestined throne has been ascended. Like so much in Kenneth's work, it's quite a mysterious reference. This predestined throne that is to be ascended. You know, I personally think it's actually the predestined throne is actually the 9th and final version of the Trilogies, but I could be wrong because I never asked Kenneth at the time, and it's a bit late now, isn't it? You know? So the first thing that strikes us when we actually read that text is the reference to transmissions. What is this reference to transmissions? What's the mechanism here? Well, transmissions originate quite simply from beyond or outside the receiver of the text. Let's have a few examples, well, 4 actually. The Ten Commandments issued to Moses. He went up to the mountain and received them incised on stone. The Enochian angelic system communicated to Dee and Kelly is another very striking example. The Book of the Law, transmitted to Crowley, is probably the one that springs to mind amongst circles such as ours. And then 7 sermons transmitted to Young, about what, 1917, 1918, something like that. They're very interesting. They vary a lot. I mean, for instance, the Book of the Law is wholly a text transmission. The Enochian system really, it is essentially the delivery of the tables and the letters, and I'm not sure if many people here have actually read the D. Kelly diaries, but it was very, very painstaking of kind of pointing to sort of letters in specific tables. It must have taken a hell of a long time, really, really a long time. But they don't always come in one session, but can be apprehended over a period of time. They need not take the form of words at all, actually. I mean, obviously, in Crowley's The Book of the Law, iOS's The Book of the Law, they do. But they need not. They can take the forms of other artistry, music, drawing, painting, sculpture, etc. Sometimes the bare bones of something are perceived and fleshed out by the recipient. Spare actually comes to mind here. Actually, his automatic drawing, he would just allow the pencil to doodle on the paper, and then when patterns start to emerge that mean something to him, that are recognisable, he would elaborate them. So you've got this fusion of what you might call inspiration from beyond the individual with the individual. So, and which is as it is, because it's not really channeling, is it? It's not really channeling at all. It's actually more creative than that. The original impetus, the original impulse of creation, actually comes from outside, but it wouldn't go anywhere if it wasn't picked up by somebody who could kind of who could give it flesh. So where do these things come from? Well, I personally think they come from imagination, but imagination writ large, cosmic imagination, if you like, universal imagination. I think conceptually, and expressing things conceptually is always a bit of a problem, because anything that can be expressed conceptually is going to be wrong. Ultimately, it's just the best that we can do at the moment. But if you can envisage a vast, well, infinite really. So it's neither large nor small, is it? But if you can imagine, if you can imagine imagination like that, and it's deep, and it's wide, but like where sort of entities jut out as little islands, then there are shallower shores of imagination that are sort of accessible by the individual who thinks of it as his or her imagination. But of course it's not. It's just cosmic imagination that is accessible. And I think that sort of impulses, creative impulses, they come through the so-called archetypes. And I think actually that's the origin of creativity altogether. I used to get very, very interested to read accounts of novelists and poets, etc., playwrights, when they'd be talking about where they actually got their inspiration from. And you'd get some people, for instance, they just kind of set the characters up and leave them to work it out for themselves. And others probably aren't aware about where things are coming from, and they just think that it's originating with them. The thing is, though, as I say, it's always filtered through the receiving mind, the earthing mind, if you like, and I think we see that most strikingly in the book of the Law. For instance, the second and third chapters, you've got sort of the language that is employed is very reminiscent, really, of Old Testament prophets, which is very interesting because it reflects Crowley's background, sort of with the Plymouth Brethren. He was steeped in the Bible from a very early age onwards. That's not to say that Crowley sat down and wrote the Book of the Law or fabricated it. What it is to say is that whatever was upsurging at the time of the transmission of the Book of the Law, it clothed itself really with a tincture of Crowley's mind. Things just don't come through what you might call pure, sort of pure, uncontaminated, as it were. In Kenneth's work, effectively, we've got two of these transmitted texts. I have the impression there were more, but they've not been published. I keep hoping that I'll come across them one day in Kenneth's papers. Anyway, those two really are the Wisdom of Shilbar, which he published in Outer Gateways, and OKBISH, which I'm talking about tonight, in case you hadn't noticed. But they're very, very different. Kenneth describes Shilbar. He received the first impulses of that about 1939, 1940. there is a chapter in Outside the Circles of Time on it, really, when he's talking about this vivid dream in which on the floor, the wall of the cavern of which a sigil was visible, and that sigil was basically what later became the Aosic sigil. And round about that time, you see, again, this is where the transmissions to Kenneth Grant are different. You're talking about impressions coming through that Kenneth elaborated, and that he carried on elaborating over the years. I mean, for instance, he seems to have had a complete wisdom of Shilbar. He didn't call it that, book Shilbar, by about 1933. He must have carried on working on it throughout 1944, because his diaries say that when he went to stay with Crowley as his secretary in 1945, he took with him this kind of what was then a nicely drawn out rendition of Shilbar, and showed it to Crowley. He doesn't actually say what Crowley said about it or what he made about it. There's nothing in Crowley's diaries, but then again, from the early 30s onwards, Crowley's diaries increasingly become just kind of very brief notations of appointments, people visiting him, etc., etc., etc. I mean, in 1936, for instance, there's hardly anything relating to the Equinox of the Gods, which is, extraordinary, really, considering, how much he rated that book. And of course, the correspondence with 1936 correspondence with Eckhart gets hardly a mention, So Grant continued to work on Shilbar over the years, and what we have in Out to Gateways is the final polished version. The very first mention of the Book of the Spider that we have is actually in Circles. Kenneth had referenced the verse in the Book of the Law about you shall learn and teach the Obeah and the Wanga. And Kenneth went on to say, it is doubtful whether Crowley learnt the Obeah and the Wanga. He certainly did not teach them. Yet, this verse seems to have anticipated the discovery of the Book of the Spider, which contains keys to a new Aeonic Obeah. One of the rituals used in New Isis Lodge was based upon it, being devised by an adept who found the book in the 29th tunnel of Set. It has 29 pages representing the lunar kalas or rays that form the spider's web. The spider is the special symbol of Obeah. Now, Kenneth mentions OKBISH, the Book of the Spider, coming during the period of New Isis Lodge, which ran from 1955 to 1962. However, as with always with Kenneth, there is a certain ambiguity in terms of dating, and I have come across references to OKBISH, the first stirrings, coming in 1952. So rather than starting at a specific time, I get the impression that it was more like an incoming tide, gradually building to a wave. Grant has this to say about that particular aspect in Beyond the Mode Zone, where he says, following upon the experience of receiving the oracles relating to the Mode Zone, beginning around 1939, it was many years before insights developed concerning the texts of transmissions such as the Wisdom of Shilbar, the Book of the Spider, and others. So, as stated by Kenneth there, and as actually mentioned by me elsewhere, a bit earlier in the talk I think, unless my notes are horrifically awry. We're looking at sort of about 1939 for Schilber. With OKBISH, though, it's a bit different. There wasn't text transmitted, at least not in the sense that we have it in the book. That sort of actually comes a bit later. When they received it, it really came as a series of voices, impressions, visions, and manifestations that would later be earthed. I'll let Kenneth actually speak, because I'm a lot better at saying these things than I am. New Isis Lodge served as the focus of a series of magical rituals based upon Typhonian archetypes. That is to say, the ritualists acted as media for the manifestation of the archetypes. When a lodge comprising skilled magicians dreams identical images in concentrated collectivity, the ensuing phenomena becomes a shared and vivid experience. This is precisely what happened in the magical workings of New Isis Lodge, but unforeseen abnormalities and ritual procedures triggered forces that swung them into entirely unexpected and unsuspected channels. One form of Typhonian template frequently deployed was an intelligence which gave the name OKBISH, a Chaldean word meaning a spider. This entity assumed control of the proceedings and, through various media, issued oracles or magical verses which were written down and later collected to form the book OKBISH. Well, having been so far, I would like to read a chapter from OKBISH. There's just a little bit more. Yeah, this is actually one of my favourite chapters, so this is a bit self-indulgent for me. I hope you'll forgive me. Oily waters, murky, lapping, licking the rotten timbers of the wharf encrusted with limehouse slime. Perhaps it was a Chandu dive where first I met her, Shoah, the evil woman. No telling where a roamer might end up and find himself face to face with the bird of Sinsinwa. There were the days, sails on the misty yellow river, Chinese dreams, junks on the poppy trail. Nothing relevant to an aeon of remorse except the faint green spirals of incense curling about the ecstatic features of a barbaric goddess. Shoah, Shoah, Shoah. How the silent river fled and hid the white frills of its troubled surf between the dark flanks of the witch queen below Festat. Only one plumbed the depths of that river and found nothing there but the bones of innumerable crocodiles bound for Fayum beneath the sacred lakes, and these bones assembled themselves and made an immaculate goddess in alabaster wrought or plaster bought of an image caster in London's Chancery Lane. Again the chinless abnormality with the lantern eyes and meldrew snout no yellow veil may hide, darkening to a silhouette against a pure pale azure sky, 16 teeth and the sharpness of death washed by surging vermilion foam. Nightmare in the eyes, they increase, they wax, growing enormous, they eclipse the whole accursed face, floating in their abysmal skies. The junk rides the gentle ripple as it laps the wharf. A single lantern showers its beams on deserted streets lit by the encroaching tide, as it eats tiny holes in the decomposing planks. They overlap the water, calm now, swaying gently like the lantern. They see those eyes, where the steep staircase cleaves a deep furrow in the outer waves and plunges. All nautical now, reeking of fish and decaying hunks. It is possible at this point to swing oneself into the staircase by means of the hawser web the spider spun but yesterday, when, strolling down Chancery Lane in brilliant sunshine, I collided head-on with that indescribable monstrosity. Now, I think that's beautiful. I mean, or is it just me? It's just me. Much of this imagery is drawn from Sax Rohmer's novel Dope. Example, the references to Limehouse, to Honan, to Shandu, to Shoah, to the evil woman, to the poppy trails, and there's a lot of punning in there. The reference, for instance, to No Telling Where a roamer might end up and find himself face to face with the bird of Sin Sin Wa. I mean, that's obviously a play on the name of Sax Rohmer. So I think that's extraordinarily beautiful. So we have the Ninth Arch, very, very, very tense, very, very tense, dense text, and so you might think, well, what's it all about? Why should I want to read the Ninth Arch? What good will it do me? You know, when, say, I can sort of read a novel by, you know, God knows who, etc. Well, Kenneth actually got there before you, actually, in that sense. And he said, as already mentioned in the general introduction to this book, the ritualists of New Isis Lodge utilised certain novels and stories. Oh, I'm sorry. Forget that, scrub that. Yes, so this is actually what he wrote. The reader is invited to assemble the equations relating to the verses of Book 29 and to interpret them in the light of his or her own magical universe. The correspondences reveal the essentially Typhonian complexion of the oracles. The linkages will disclose by their interrelation an entirely new perspective on the synchronicities, the tangential fusion of impossibles, and the prophetic value of techniques somewhat akin to the Darwinian formula known as the paranoiac critical method, herein applied Kabbalistically. The entire process may be described as a systematization of delusions, hallucinating holistic realities that are perpetually fulfilling themselves in the Mauve zone, on the way to achieving carnal manifestation at the will of the magician. The magician, in fact, becomes the Mauve zone, the ground on which all eons enact simultaneously their apotheosis outside the circles of time. So that basically is what it's all about. It's like with the Book of the Law, it's what you derive from the Book of the Law. It's what the Book of the Law means to you. It's not what Aleister Crowley thought it meant, or Kenneth Grant, or anybody else that's ever commented on the Book of the Law. These things, they're always helpful, but you have to find your own way through. And the same is true. The same is true with the Ninth Arch. It just so happens that Kenneth has written an incredibly dazzling, fruitful book, and so forth. But still, like with everything else, it's what it means to you. I mean, for instance, you can go and read Bertolt Brecht's Life of Galileo, you know, and yes, sure, it's very, very pleasurable, but it's what you derive from Galileo. That's the point. Have I got time to just read out? It's the last one, page 32. Sorry, chapter 32. I mean, I said chapter 6 was my favourite. I was actually lying. It was chapter 32. I'd heard that chapter 6 was by far the most popular thing, so I was trying to be with it. You'll notice, by the way, in this things from Against the Light, or that refer to Against the Light. And Against the Light was written, it was originally going to be published between Beyond the Mosaic and the Ninth Arch. It's a prelude to the Ninth Arch in fictional form. From the stairhead she descended, bearing the battered volume 67964. An innocent tale for children who became the children of Isis. A page of it is enough to send you beyond sleep. A torn page of it, covered in childhood scribbles and scrawls, if held against the light, reveals. I followed the critter's advice. That is why I know the contents of Grant's grimoire and the secret of the Ninth Arch. Why not follow the spider's web? Hop from strand to strand of its glittering tracery. Meet the awesome insect, like a vast beetle emerging from the vulva of Isis. Why not? To do so signals the end of this world web, and as one dangles over narrow voids above Dunsanian gulfs, even a Sime would hesitate. Let us then close the grimoire. Let us not dive into the arms of her whose brow bears the telltale mark of an alien cliff-off. Phineas Black, deep, mysterious Phineas Black, took back to the stars the secret of an awful spawn. Tarry a while, though your feet slip upon the crazy pathway. Though the arches fly past in your abysmal fall, like the cavernous eye sockets in a skull from which Baphomet even would recoil. The shadow of Anubis, like Mr. Meldrum, walks unbidden in a human walker. Stalker of nightmares in the aftermath of holy days. Hunted, the hunter hunts. No bright survivor. And an aeon of darkness, the darkness that is undying, wherein the Nosferatu eat the shades. On the tablecloth, with knife crisp folds, is spread the feast. Fall to. Thank you.
You have been speaking about some upcoming Starfire publications.
Yeah, well, sort of, now that with the Ninth Arch, the Typhonian Trilogies have been reprinted, with one exception actually. The 2015 edition of Outer Gateways hasn't quite sold out, so that won't. I keep getting emails from people. Oh, when are you going to issue a paperback edition of Outer Gateways? You know, I explain to them that it's just not economic to do a paperback only version. It's just going to have to wait. Well, anyway, now that I've finished the Typhonian Trilogies, you know, I can't believe the freedom I've got. And I've been working for several years with Henrik Bogdan on collected works of Akkad, which will actually extend to several volumes. And the first one is the so-called major works of QBL, the Egyptian Revival, and the Anatomy of the Body of God. I've given so many possible dates for this over the years, but I really think late summer, autumn, it will actually be out. I'm also working on, again, it's going to extend for several volumes, the Selected Letters of Kenneth Grant, Volume 1. I was going to take it up to 1969, but I've got too much material there, and I don't want to have to leave out good material. And I must admit, I don't want something the size of the Ninth Arch or the Incoming of the Ian of Mar. You know, they're kind of just a bit too unwieldy for, you know, for my liking. I mean, my God, I mean, for Incoming of the Ian of Mar, I even had to leave some letters out. This 1936 letter from Crowley to Akkad came to light, you know, and sort of like, I just think it had lain somewhere for decades, so no one else was aware of it. And I kind of thought, I mean, it didn't amount to very much, to be fair. It didn't cost a great deal. You know, you just kind of thought about the kudos of publishing a previously unpublished Crowley thing. But then I thought, okay, so what do I leave out in order to put this in? And when you looked at it in that light, you thought, no, go away. So I just tore it up and threw it away.
Lots of people asking about Steffi's illustrated book with the
Yeah, I was about to come to that.
Sorry.
Actually. Stay out of my brain. Yeah, the third thing is Steffi in the mid-40s. I think she finished it in 1944. She did this kind of calligraphy rendition of the Book of the Law, and she made it an illuminated manuscript, and so far odd pages of it have been published. There's a number of pages in this edition of the Ninth Arch, for instance. There's a few more pages published in Henrik Bogdan's, in the Servants of the Star and the Snake, the book that Henrik Bogdan came out with a few years ago. I've already had the whole thing photographed to a very, very good resolution in preparation for publishing it, and I would like to bring it out next year. I hesitate to make any firm commitments because I've just got too many good things to publish, to be honest. Now that sort of the Typhonian trilogies have been reprinted, I want to start publishing Kenneth's unpublished work. There's some really good stuff there. During the 1950s, he wrote a really excellent book on spare, you know, on this sort of depths of spare's what you might call magical mystical philosophy, etc., etc., etc. And that's never been published, and I'd like to publish that. There's lots of stuff. There's lots of unpublished essays that are very, very good. The one that really excites me, to be honest, though, is the Selected Letters of Kenneth Grant. I mean, when I was going through, because Steffi asked me to catalogue the letters, you know, in Kenneth's correspondence file. So I'd be round there, and when I came across bits that I thought that she'd be interested in, I'd read them aloud to her, and I was quite right to do so, because she's got enthralled by it, you know. And then one day she mused, she said, "Do you think that we could publish these, Michael?" And I thought, thank you, God, because, you know, that's not why I actually read it to her. You know, I'm quite innocent there. I didn't have any ulterior motives, but it's just such marvellous stuff, and it includes a series of letters that Kenneth wrote to Steffi while he was actually living at Netherwood. He was writing to Steffi almost every day, and I'm very, very pleased to be able to include those. Anyway, that's a brief account of what Starfire and its little helpers have got lined up for us.
I might I'm just wondering, did the process of republishing the Ninth Arch bring about any new sort of reflections of Against the Light for you?
Well, yes it did. When Kenneth submitted the typescript of the Ninth Arch, you know, because he was always very, very punctilious. He would submit it, you know, and obviously I would reject it if I felt like it. But I mean, obviously I wasn't going to reject it, because I don't think he quite realised that, you know, how highly regarded he was. But when I got the typescript for the Ninth Arch, I could recognise a lot of Against the Light in there, and of course, Against the Light was actually the first book that Starfire, the first actual book, as distinct from Starfire magazine, that Starfire published, and they throw a very, very interesting light on each other. Actually, I mean, I've probably read Against the Light more often than anybody else in the world, you know, because I do like to reread it from time to time, you know, because I just think it's such a marvellous book. But sort of, it's very, very difficult to answer your question, really, isn't it? Because every time you read a book, new things come to mind. You spot new things, you know. You've read it and it's chuntering away in the background of your mind, you know, developing, etc., etc., etc. That's why, sort of, you know, a good book, you go back to it again and again and again, and you just come across stuff that you just don't recall reading before, you know, or stuff that you do recognise, but it just means something entirely different. I don't know if I've answered your question.
No, yeah, very interesting. Yeah, because I mean, to me, it's like I've been looking at the Ninth Arch, obviously, and it almost sort of Against the Light seems to describe the circumstances relating to the Ninth Arch. But
Yes,
I don't know if that's just.
It does. No, it does. Kenneth said to me that the reason that he wrote Against the Light was because, I mean, he was writing Against the Light from the early 1980s. You know, I've got just fragments of earlier drafts and so forth. But then the final form of it, he envisaged it as putting some of the themes of OKBISH and the Ninth Arch into fiction form, because he said, you know, otherwise, you know, if I don't prepare this, people just aren't going to believe this. It's just something so fantastic. I mean, you might have recognised in the chapters of OKBISH that I read out, little snippets from Against the Light that obviously have echoes there, you know, mention of Phineas Black. In the first one I read out, the mention of walking down Chancery Lane in bright daylight. So they're very related, those two. Welcome everybody to this Zoom presentation of what you might call a general introduction to the Ninth Arch. Now, we first published the Ninth Arch in 2002. It was in fact the last Saturday before Christmas of 2002. We had the launch at the Plough in Museum Street, and because it was a few days before Christmas, it became almost a Christmas celebration with mince pies and mulled wine. Very nice. We published a second edition of the book in 2016. When I say second edition of the book, what I mean by that really is that it had a few corrections in there drawn from Kenneth Grant's own personal copy of the Ninth Arch, and we basically added to the plates, printed a lot of had a lot of them printed in colour, added some new plates, and it was this 2016 second edition that we recently republished in both hardback and paperback format. Now, in 1980, Frederick Muller, who'd been Kenneth's publisher since the Magical Revival in 1972, they published Outside the Circles of Time, and it was, in fact, the last book by Kenneth Grant that they published. Kenneth did submit Hecate's Fountain to them, but they weren't interested and said no. And I personally think they'd already decided that they wouldn't be publishing anything by Kenneth Grant anymore. Weiser in the States were interested enough to actually sign a contract, but they were obliged to withdraw from the contract even before the proofing stage. And so Kenneth was without a publisher for quite a long time until Scoob in the early 1990s. Although he didn't have a publisher, though, he pressed on with plans for the Typhonian trilogies, and in particular, planning out the third and final trilogy, Outer Gateways, Beyond the Mode Zone, and the Ninth Arch. He planned that, for instance, one of the two transmitted texts, The Wisdom of Shilba, would appear in Outer Gateways, and that the Ninth Arch would basically be an extended commentary on the Book of the Spider. Well, I've mentioned The Wisdom of Shilba and the Book of the Spider, and I think it's very necessary to say that this is all heavily connected with New Isis Lodge, which ran from 1955 to 1962. What I'm showing here on this slide is a draft that Kenneth did for the New Isis Lodge seal. Anybody who's seen the previous recensions of the Ninth Arch, or indeed has got the present reprint, will recognise it. It's basically a plate in there. And Kenneth, this really was the finished form, which you can see. Well, to put it in a proverbial nutshell, the Ninth Arch is woven around a transmission received over the course of New Isis Lodge workings, the Book of the Spider, or the Book OKBISH, Liber OKBISH. This transmission first started during a magical working in the 29th tunnel of Set, Khalilfi, around, I don't know, about the midpoint, I think, of New Isis Lodge. The principal medium for the transmissions was a priestess known as Sora Arem. Now, this same woman appears in Kenneth Grant's novel Against the Light as Margaret Leasing. And in fact, she's sometimes referenced in the Ninth Arch as Li Sing, a very nice little play on words, reflecting the fact that she took so much interest in Chinese magic, Chinese sorcery, particularly the cult of the coup. Margaret Leasing wasn't the only medium for the transmissions, but she played by far the larger part and coordinated the work of several other priestesses in the lodge. I mentioned the Ninth Arch, and it did, of course. So the Book of the Spider is essentially a collection of cryptic oracles which were received over a number of years and were in retrospect arranged into 29 chapters, each of 29 verses. Some of the verses were not read or were not heard or have been lost, but this is the basic pattern. A couple of years after the original transmissions were received, the current once again became active, and a second transmission materialized. This was a smaller number of verses, and again was arranged retrospectively into 3 additional chapters, each of 29 verses each. You will find in the Ninth Arch that there is a division between the two, shall we call it, receptions. Now, before we go any further, there's an interesting reference to this, to the more general scheme in Hecate's Fountain. And I'll quote from Grant here. In 1955, the star known as New Isis began transmitting the vibrations that were received by New Isis Lodge at that time. These transmissions lasted 7 years, and their results are embodied in my trilogies and in a certain secret grimoire known as the Book of the Spider, which will remain unpublished until a predestined throne has been ascended. So in this quote, Kenneth refers to transmissions. And in fact, we hear a lot about transmitted texts. So what is really meant by the term? I think that initially we'd better stop and remind ourselves of what Kenneth had to say in relation to the transmission of the wisdom of Shulba. The series of verses entitled collectively The Wisdom of Shulba were not written down at any particular time or place, although the state of consciousness in which they were received was invariably the same. The vision was initiated as early as the year 1939, when the vision of Shulba, when the vision of Eosic first manifested in the manner described in Outside the Circle of Time, chapter 8. The vision unfolded sporadically throughout the time of Eosic's association with Aleister Crowley and Austin Osman Spare. But the dynamic aspect of the working, that is to say, the integration of the vision into a coherent whole, occurred during the period of New Isis Lodge's existence. I think that's a very, very interesting way of pointing out the essential differences between OKBISH and Shulba. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about transmissions in this context. Now, transmissions, they're not a matter of establishing some sort of radio contact with a Discarna entity and transcribing what the Discarna entity has to say. It would be nice if it was that straightforward. However, a transmission can be via any of the senses. Often it will be intuited or subtly apprehended with the imagination as catalyst. Now, imagination is not whim or fancy, although that's the term that a lot of people give it. Rather, imagination is a space in which things occur. It's cosmic, though there are individual areas of awareness of imagination, and it's those areas around the individual of which he or she is more immediately aware. And it's these areas that we regard as our imagination. However, it is not ours, but a common or cosmic area, the local reaches of which we are more immediately aware. Transmission can take many forms. Essentially, it's an inspirational flow into the more personal areas of imagination and will often become clothed in forms drawn from the personal subconscious. We see this in Lovecraft's work, for instance. Much of the inspiration occurred through dream and expressed through imagery drawn from the extensive reading and daydreaming of Lovecraft's childhood. This is not to be wondered at, really. Much as light is refracted and transformed by its passage through a prism or a piece of coloured glass, or as a setting sun through atmospheric detritus produces a pageant of glorious and stirring colours. So the transmission of a current will be coloured by the personal areas of imagination. Again, not to be wondered at. To give a few, for instances, the wind only becomes manifest in the stirring leaves of the tree through which it moves, the perfumes which it agitates, the skin against which it brushes, the shapes into which it swirls the desert sand. as a matter of interest, I mentioned earlier, or Kenneth mentioned earlier, that Shilbar essentially started life in 1939. And what you might call the first recension, first written down recension of Shilbar, was essentially done in 1943. But when he went to stay with Crowley at Netherwood, the secretary, in 1945, he took it with him. And I think this actually survives as 2 exercise books. And he notes in his diary that he showed it with Crowley, and he discussed it with Crowley, but Crowley doesn't make any reference to it in his diaries or elsewhere, which really is hardly surprising, because Crowley's diaries from the early 30s onwards become progressively slimmer and slimmer, becoming mere details of appointments, people he's seen, letters that he's received, letters that he sent, etc. Anyway, Grant continued to work on it across the years, and the version published in Outer Gateways being the final version, and it's got, I think, 4 chapters of commentary, and extremely interesting it is too. So let's move on to consider OKBISH, the Book of the Spider, like say how it was received. First mention that Kenneth ever made throughout his trilogies of the Book of the Spider, OKBISH, is in Outside the Circles of Time. Kenneth made a reference to a verse in the Book of the Law in which Crowley was instructed to learn and to teach the Obeah and the Wonga, the methods of African sorcery. Kenneth then continued, it is doubtful whether Crowley learned the Obeah and the Wonga. He certainly did not teach them. Yet this verse seems to have anticipated the discovery of the Book of the Spider, which contains keys to a new Aeonic Obeah. One of the rituals used in New Isis Lodge was based upon it, being devised by an adept who found the book, OKBISH, in the 29th tunnel of Set. It has 29 pages representing the lunar kalas or rays that form the spider's web. The spider is a special symbol of Obeah. As already indicated, the wisdom of Shilbar started earlier, from around 1939, but outwardly, OKBISH is a very different kettle of fish, as they say. There was no text transmitted, at least not in the sense of the text of the finished version of OKBISH that was published in the 9th Arch. Rather, during New Isis Lodge workings, they received a series of voices, impressions, visions, and manifestations, subsequently rearranged as text. This is very difficult to convey, so let me quote Kenneth on the matter, because he expresses these things a little better than me. New Isis Lodge served as the focus of a series of magical rituals based upon Typhonian archetypes. That is to say, the ritualists acted as media for the manifestation of the archetypes. When a lodge comprising skilled magicians dreams identical images in concentrated collectivity, the ensuing phenomena becomes shared and vivid experience. This is precisely what happened in the magical workings of New Isis Lodge. But unforeseen abnormalities in ritual procedures triggered forces that swung them into entirely unexpected and unsuspected channels. One form of Typhonian template frequently deployed was an intelligence, which gave the name OKBISH, a Chaldean word meaning a spider. This entity assumed control of the proceedings and, through various media, issued oracles or magical verses, which were written down and later collected to form the book OKBISh. Well, I've talked about Kenneth and his remarks on the methods of New Isis Lodge workings. And there's one further quote that I'd like to read out by him. And this one gives a more general impression of the working methods of New Isis, a lot of the people in New Isis Lodge, and in particular, I think, explaining a lot of this Book of the Spider and the symbolism in the spider. As already mentioned in the general introduction to this book, the ritualists of New Isis Lodge utilised certain novels and stories as other magicians might use paintings or musical composition to effect perichoresis and astral encounters. They entered into a tale as they might enter into a given picture, a scene, a desert, a crowded drawing room, or other venue. Applied to the novel, the process develops dramatically as a vividly kinetic experience that becomes startlingly oracular. We used, principally, Richard Marsh's novel, The Beetle, and Sax Rohmer's A Tale of Chinatown, or Dope, for no other reason than because the chief scryer had recently read these writings, and because other lodge members also were acquainted with them. Marsh's tale, in particular, was chosen because it contained the only published account known to the present author of the children of Isis, and therefore seemed en rapport with the wisdom of Shulbar and with the oracles of OKBISH. Now, this is, to me, a very, very important piece of writing, because what it's really got to say is that a lot of the imagery that we encounter in the Book of the Spider is actually been coloured by or draws upon the imagery that you get in The Beetle, for instance, and Rohmer's A Tale of Chinatown, or better known as his novel Dope. This is very interesting. I mean, presumably, if, say, Margaret Leasing and the other members of New Isis Lodge had read something else which was uppermost in their mind, then it would have been expressed in different terms, using different imagery. I think that's an extremely interesting point. What I'd like to go on with now is to read from chapter 6 of OKBISH, quite possibly reverting to a moment to, you know, some teenager enthusing over the Beatles. I'd probably describe this as my favourite chapter, if you like, collection of verses in OKBISH. I would like to preface this particular one, though, by actually taking a little bit further what I said there about so much of the imagery being tinted with the contents of the, if you like, imagination of the members of New Isis Lodge at the time. Because in this one, for instance, that I'm about to read out, there's a lot drawn from imagery in Roma, and throughout the book OKBISH, the Book of the Spider, we also get imagery drawn from other characters in fiction, like Helen Vaughan and Mrs. Beaumont, from Arthur Macken's story, The Great God Pan. And as I say, these are merely masks or clothing, and they're not intended to point by themselves to profundities. Nobody's saying, Helen Vaughan is really, really important. You know, go out there and read everything that Helen Vaughan ever wrote. That's to misunderstand it, really. Later on, there are also references to other scenes, such as Roma's Brood of the Witch Queen, for instance, some of Lovecraft's stories, like the character of Joseph Curwen in The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. Anyway, I'll just go on and read from chapter 6. Oily waters, murky, lapping, licking the rotten timbers of the wharf, encrusted with limehouse slime. Perhaps it was a Chandu dive where first I met her, Shoah, the evil woman. No telling where Roma might end up and find himself face to face with the bird of Sinsinoir. There were, in those days, sails on the misty yellow river, Chinese dreams, junks on the poppy trail, nothing relevant to an aeon of remorse, except the faint green spirals of incense curling about the ecstatic features of a barbaric goddess. Shoah, Shoah, Shoah. How the silent river fled and hid the white frills of its troubled surf between the dark flanks of the Witch Queen below Verstadt. Only one plumbed the depths of that river and found nothing there. Nothing but the bones of innumerable crocodiles bound for Fayum beneath the sacred lake. And these bones assembled themselves and made an immaculate goddess in alabaster wrought or plaster bought of an image caster in London's Chancery Lane. Again, there's the chinless abnormality with the lantern eyes and meldrum snout no yellow veil may hide, darkening to a silhouette against the pale azure sky, 16 teeth and the sharpness of death washed by a surging vermilion foam. Nightmare in the eyes, they increase, they wax, growing enormous, they eclipse the whole accursed face. Floating in their abysmal skies, the junk rides the gentle ripple as it laps the wharf. A single lantern showers its beams on deserted streets lit by the encroaching tide as it eats tiny holes in the decomposing planks. They overlap the water, calm now, swaying gently in the lantern. They see those eyes, where the steep staircase cleaves a deep furrow in the outer waves and plunges. All nautical now, reeking of fish and decaying hunks. It is possible at this point to swing oneself onto the staircase by means of the hawser web the spiders spun yesterday, strolling down Chancery Lane in brilliant sunshine. I collided head on with that indescribable monstrosity. Now, I think many of us, at least those who've read it, would recognise many references to Sax Rohmer's novel Dope. For instance, references to Limehouse, to Honan, to Chandu, to Shoah, to the Yellow River, to the poppy trails. There's the languor of dream, of reverie. The images seem to drift, they shift, they coalesce, to emerge, to flicker, to fall back. I find them very beautiful, actually. That chapter 6, to my mind, it is fairly typical. There is, though, another element to it. Several years ago, we published a short story by Kenneth, well, many years ago, actually. It was entitled Against the Light. Now, in the original scheme of things, Against the Light was to be published between Beyond the Mozone and the Ninth Arch. And it was a dramatisation, fictionalisation of some of the principal themes in the Book of the Spider. Unfortunately, this never came about because shortly before working on Beyond the Mozone, Scoob actually suspended work on Kenneth Grant, and Starfire Publishing published Against the Light as a standalone book. However, when we did republish in 2016, we did indeed have Against the Light between Beyond the Mozone and the Ninth Arch. Kenneth Grant described Against the Light to me as I said, a fictional treatment, and he said to me, "I've done this, Michael, because I just thought when it came to the Ninth Arch and OKBISh, I just thought nobody's going to believe this stuff. So I thought I'd prepare the way, as it were, with a story." And anyone who's read the story will recognise in that chapter 6 that I've read out, again, some images from the story. I won't read out any more chapters until the very end, when I'm going to be awfully self-indulgent and read out the last chapter. But what I would like to consider at this stage is, so I've given some insight, some background into the Ninth Arch, and we gather from all that the Ninth Arch is this absolutely vast panoply, if you like, a tightly drawn web of references. And we've also gathered from this that in the reception of Liber OKBISh, what you might call the content of Liber OKBISh has been coloured by the imagination of the people who received these texts, these oracles, these visions, whatever. So we might wonder, of what use is the Ninth Arch to us? Of what use is OKBISh to us personally, other than an academic study? A very, very interesting incident in the career of a very, very interesting man. Well, it's a very good question, and I'm about to give what I think is a very good answer, and it's actually given by Kenneth, and it's, again, it's in the Ninth Arch. It's one of the sections of preamble to the Ninth Arch, and says, just a bit. The reader is invited to assemble the equations relating to the versions of Book 29 and to interpret them in the light of his or her own magical universe. The correspondences reveal the essentially Typhonian complexion of the oracles. The linkages will disclose by their interrelation an entirely new perspective on the synchronicities, the tangential fusions of impossibles, and the prophetic value of techniques somewhat akin to the Darwinian formula known as the paranoid critical method, herein applied Kabbalistically. The entire process may be described as a systematization of delusions, hallucinating holistic realities that are perpetually fulfilling themselves in the Mozone, on the way to achieving carnal manifestation at the will of the magician. The magician, in fact, becomes the Mozone, the ground on which all eons enact simultaneously their apotheosis outside the circles of time. So Kenneth is answering precisely that point that I've raised there. I'm very gratified to learn that he heard my question in the late 1990s of my talk here. But I mean, seriously, I think that gives a very, very good insight into the value of not just the Ninth Arch, not just Liber OKBISh or Shulbar, but Kenneth's work generally, because Kenneth Grant's work is very, very subjective, and it's just really, if you like, giving you cues, giving you ideas, giving you inspiration to go out and do it yourself, as it were. So again, to sort of paraphrase the cliche, it's rather than don't do this at home, kids, it's do this at home, kids. You know? Right, so I'd like to finish up with reading out one more chapter of OKBISH, and this is the final chapter 32. Again, it's got lots of imagery in there. Again, if you've read Against the Light, you will recognize some of the references. Write these spells. They are woven by Arid, picked up by the first alchemist, passed on to the second after centuries have passed. These are things Earth should know, that when Joseph became David, Arid's formula was made complete. Zos had it from a page of Grant's grimoire, even in Yelda's time. Explain, but darkly, how Arid and Vaughn are one, that she became Yelda and L'Oreal and Fame. Maka knew the secret, but the master did not. When Eosic showed him Shulbar, the master knew the nest had been found, and that the nest is Shulbar. Ixaxar lam Iwas Ilyaran bel Eosic. What a lugubrious game. But Earth should know this, that out of lost time, the cliff off Adarth will descend, below Malkuth, and void themselves through the tunnels of Set. A man named Black will open the gate. Those will fall through, whom Black Eagle lets pass. You will recover the stone, you who hold the sword of Zin, and understand the knowing wink of Zos, and the unwavering glance of Sin-Sin-War, whose eye is single, and the word that arose. Set all this forth in the special book, so that those that read will quote the words of the Master's angel. Why hast thou whispered so ambiguous things? And if they reply, be precise, ask them where they're from, and where their destination. They cannot reply. Or ask of them their name, as the yellow one asked of me. Only those of Kem, they know their name, which was their word. It took flesh of itself, and in Fastat manifested. They could tell you why the coffer was void in the pyramid without a name. It is without a name because born of the eon without a word outside the circles of time, and of the tangled light, Crick's core. Arid's elemental of the black winds, the tripod and the stone, and the raven of Conan. Well, I got my notes a bit mixed up there, folks, which I'm very sorry. And what I read out to you was something else. So, no. Okay, so I will very quickly read 32, which is the closing chapter. From the stairhead she descended, bearing the battered volume 67964. An innocent tale for children who became the children of Isis. A page of it is enough to send you beyond sleep. A torn page of it, covered in childhood scribbles and scrawls, if held against the light, reveals. I followed the critter's advice. That is why I know the contents of Grant's grimoire and the secret of the ninth arch. Why not follow the spider's web? Hop from strand to strand of its glittering tracery. Meet the awesome beast. Like a vast beetle emerging from the vulva of Isis. Why not? To do so signals the end of this world web, and as one dangles over narrow voids above Dunsonian gulfs, even a sign would hesitate. Let us then close the grimoire. Let us not dive into the arms of her, whose brow bears the telltale mark of an alien clip-off. Phineas Black, deep, mysterious Phineas Black, took back the stars, the secret of an awful spawn. Tarry a while, though your feet slip upon the crazy pathway, though the arches fly past in your abysmal fall, like the cavernous eye sockets in a skull from which a Baphomet even would recoil. The shadow of Anubis, like Mr. Meldrum, walks unbidden in human walking, stalker of nightmares in the aftermath of holy days. Hunted, the hunter hunts, no bright survivor, and an eon of darkness, the darkness that is undying, wherein the Nosferatu eats shades. On the tablecloth, with a knife crisp folds, is spread the feast, all two. So, that concludes the final verse, the final chapter of OKBISH, the Book of the Spider. I hope that in the course of this talk, I've given you a little bit of insight into the Ninth Arch. I've given you a little flavour of the Ninth Arch itself. I've given you an idea of how the Ninth Arch, of how OKBISH actually came into being, and why it teams with the imagery that it does. And so I'd like to say thank you very much for putting up with me in this last, 40, 45 minutes, for being, no doubt, kind and overlooking my occasional stumbles and getting lost in my notes and giving you an additional chapter of the Ninth Arch. Without further ado, I'll close this book. Thank you very much. I would, and I mean, to pick up your your last analogy when you said jazzy, this kind of 1955 to 1962 was a sort of jazz era, and Kenneth was very, very keen on jazz, in particular Count Basie. So that's quite a good analogy, really. He did in poetry and had an extensive library. He kind of, like say, he was writing poetry from a very early age, and he just carried on writing poetry. And, you know, I personally think that he's a very good writer. He's not to some people's taste, though, you know, but that's the way it should be with him. But yeah, I think it's a very good analogy. First of all, you can sort of write television out of the picture view because he never had a television in his life. Cinema-wise, I think especially in the 1950s, I think that he and Steffi went to see quite a lot of film, actually. He he saw, for instance, Anger's inauguration of the Pleasure Dome when it was released, and liked it so much that he wrote to Anger, and they had a very amicable correspondence in 1955, and indeed Anger visited them several times. Had a bit of a falling out later on. I'm not sure why really. But yeah, I mean, Kenneth was really taken with this whole Dracula mythology, and he saw various recensions of the film's Dracula. It's very, very interesting, for instance, that he was so taken with Bela Lugosi, because if you look at some of those photographs from Kenneth, especially in the early 50s, he just looks so much like the young Bela Lugosi, you know. In fact, you kind of start to wonder, yes, I've never seen them in the same room. Do you? So, no. So I don't think that he was that much influenced by film, actually, and indeed, I kind of think that sort of later on he didn't go to see film very much. He was acquainted with Klaus Kinski's Dracula, and what was that, 1980s? So he was obviously going to see films, you know, as late as then. Well, I mean, 1980 seems late to somebody like me, you know. The problem you've got is kind of like the scryings, the stuff that Margaret Leasing sees in The Crystal Ball, in Against the Light. They're very, very specific. They're actually related. They're actually related to Kenneth Grant. Basically, if you want to know a bit more about the methodology and how the oracles came about, I read a passage out there. You will find it in the preambles to the Ninth Arch, you know, the receiving sort of oracles and visions and things like that. What a lot of people don't understand, I think, about what Kenneth referred to as the elsewhere as the magic collages of Hecate's Fountain, is that a lot of the time their methodology was actually shared dream, actually the creation of images as close as possible. And Kenneth says in there that when that's done, it's very, very intense and it's very vivid. And they also applied it to paintings, to novels, for instance. They would kind of say, they would sort of just kind of walk into, I don't know, a particular incident in Roma's Dope, or, you know, the Beetle. That's the methodology, really. The problem is, the problem that you get in a lot of Kenneth Grant's work is that he's not too precise about things, you know. But certainly you can pick up, you know, odd bits here and there throughout it, and you can actually piece together. But really, to really understand it, you'd have to go out and do that sort of thing yourself, you know, sort of have these kind of intense collective visions with people and kind of see what happens with it. It's something that's not really amenable to kind of abstract academic study, I'm afraid. Like, you know, so much in magic and the occult and mysticism. You know, I mean, mysticism, for instance, you know, the vision of union with God. Well, you won't really understand that until you start to experience an epiphany, something around that, you know, until you do. And again, you can read as many descriptions of dhyana and samadhi as you like, but until you get a fleeting glimpse of subject and object being wiped out and just kind of isness, then it just doesn't mean anything. I hasten to add that doesn't mean that I'm sort of claiming to be some sort of master who considers a day wasted if I haven't had several dhyānas or samadhis before breakfast. Far from it, but I have experienced what I think are the fleeting foothills of that experience, and until you have an experience like that, then all the descriptions of it you read. I'll draw an analogy. I became obsessed with the LSD experience in the mid 1960s, and I remember it in 1969. You know, this friend of mine, he'd taken LSD, and I was, you know, all agog, you know, and pestering him for information, you know, about what it was. And he said, well, you know, I just can't describe it. I just can't put it into words, I'm afraid, you know. And so I just thought it was fobbing me off. And when I took it the first time, I could see exactly what he meant, you know, because the experience is really in terms of your own experience. I mean, for instance, I would actually sort of like say memories, sensations, images that I recognize, but I hadn't experienced for decades. You know, they come from my younger days. They were there, and there was kind of like, there's some things that you just can't put into words, really. You know, you just have to go and experience. I think largely, Carl, but see, the problem is, Kenneth never really stuck to definitions. And so when you go through his work and look at the various references to the Mozone, sometimes it will be on the level of dream, or maybe something behind dream. Other times it's something more diffuse. On the whole, and bearing in mind that little text, that little quote from Kenneth that I read out about, you know, how to go and do it yourself at home, kids, etc. Mozone there becomes more akin to cosmic imagination, in my view. It's where all the images arise and bubble forth. That's what I think. I think it's in, I remember when I was very young, one of the first Crowley things that I got hold of was the Holy Books. It was the 3 Holy Books brought out by Regedy, published by Sangreal in about 1970. And Regedy makes much the same point in his brief introduction to it there, actually, that that there were certain books that were designed not to try and explain exalted states of consciousness, of awareness, etc., but using imagery to point the reader in that direction. You know, it's that sort of famous thing about fingers pointing at the moon. You know. Basically, when Kenneth submitted the 9th Arch to me, you know, and we sort of embarked on preparing it for publication, what I did was I took it chapter by chapter and went through each chapter. I'm talking about really essentially the commentary now. Read it through chapter by chapter, and I focused particularly on the gematria, and every item of gematria on there, I checked that it was correct, that it all added up, etc. And sometimes it would take me hours to do a chapter, because if you think about it, all the variant spellings, things like that. And I wanted to have this idea that that I'd say to Kenneth, well, okay, that doesn't add up. So he would either give me the spelling to prove that it did add up, or alternatively change it. And in most instances, there was an alternative lettering, if you like, or way of or interpretation of the letters that I'd missed out. On some occasions, I was quite right. He'd got it wrong. So he would promptly go away, use another piece of gematria, and it would result in exactly the same thing. Another example is the first edition of Outside the Circles of Time. There were an awful lot of errors in there, errors in gematria. And I remember a friend of mine sort of referring to them one day and saying, well, you know, the thing is, they don't really make any difference, you know, and you see that's it, because the way that Kenneth is using gematria, the gematria is not there to point to a relationship. The gematria, you don't look at a piece of gematria and say, aha, and you ferret out a relationship. It's actually the other way around. The purpose of the gematria is to underpin an insight that Kenneth's already had, to underscore, to actually stress that insight, you know. And because I know a lot of people do get a bit excited about Kenneth's, well, when I say excited, I really mean derogatory, about Kenneth's use of gematria. And I think they're wrong, really, because, you know, he's not saying, you know, this is how it should be. He will, when he wants to find, when he wants to use something to underpin an insight, he will just use anything that comes to hand. But, you know, it doesn't mean that if that's proved wrong, the insight collapses, because the gematria is just underpinning of an insight that's already there. Yes, not immediately though, but I'd like to do it next year. And in fact, a while ago, in preparation for it, I had all of the pages photographed to a very high resolution, you know, in preparation for that. But yeah, I'd like to do it. I'd like to do it next year. Now that we've reprinted all of the volumes of the Typhonian Trilogies, apart from Outer Gateways, which is probably going to, the 2015 edition is still in print, and it's probably going to probably sell out a bit later on this year. But there are two things on the go at the moment, actually. One of them is Henrik Bolton. It extends to several volumes, sort of collected works of Fraser Rucker. And the first volume of which is the so-called major works, consisting of QBL, the Egyptian Revival, and the Anatomy of the Body of God. They've all three of those were typeset some time ago, and I'm just now waiting for Henrik's general introduction to it, and it should just be a couple of months' work after that to get it all ready. So that's going to be either late summer or early autumn, I think. I also started work quite a while ago on the first volume of a projected selected letters of Kenneth Grant, and I kind of, after inputting all of these letters, I had to sort of turn my attention to other things. And at the beginning of this year, I picked up the editing of them again. So that's in preparation, and I'd like to aim for late autumn or early winter for that. I know it sounds disturbingly precise when I put it in those terms, but yeah, that's coming along. That, to me, to be honest, Selected Letters of Kenneth Grant is, it will be one of the most exciting books that Starfire has ever published, really. It contains, amongst other things, Kenneth's letters to Steffi whilst he was staying at Netherwood in 1945. It contains his letters to Crowley, you know, for all the way from, although strictly speaking, not a letter, I'm going to be publishing his absolutely riveting description of his first meeting with Crowley in December 1944. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then, you know, going into next year, 2024, which seems a long, long way away to me at the moment, as well as Steffi's illustrated book of the law. I'd like to turn my attention really to publishing. There's quite a lot of unpublished work by Kenneth that's there, and I'd like to publish that. For instance, while Spare was alive, he did this really, really interesting study of Spare that Spare saw and liked, and I'd like to publish that. And there's quite a lot of essays. You know, there's a lot of good stuff still to come. Well, thank you very much.